Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Herbert Hoover, and the focus is the great engineer. The year is 1895. Hoover has just graduated from Stanford University with a degree in mining and geology, but he can't get a job. There's a recession going on in the United States. None of the mines are hiring, certainly not a college boy. He's growing really frustrated. Finally gets a job at the Reward Mine as a mucker down in the bowels of the mining industry, pushing a hand car, filling it with ore 10 hours a day, 7 days a week for $2 a day. He was happy to have something, but even that did not last as there were cutbacks, so he kept looking. The Mayflower Mine opened up another job, very similar, working deep in the bowels of the mine. In fact, that's what his boss told him he had to do. Get in there and dig. You need a nose for gold. It can't be learned by sticking your nose in a book. You'll develop it by working where the gold is. And that's what he did. 7 days a week, 10 hours a day, he worked hard. He gained the respect of his colleagues, which wasn't easy. He learned from them. They learned from him. But look, this isn't what he went to college for. He wanted to be an engineer. He wanted to lead in the mining industry. So he sought out a gentleman by the name of Louis Janin, a French-born mining engineer who was the top consultant now on the west coast of the United States. And he liked helping out young engineers, so he agreed to go to lunch with Hoover. They got along. He was impressed with Hoover's credentials from Stanford and some of his recommendations. And Hoover put it out there. He said, look, I'd like a job. I want to work for you. And Janet said, look, I got a whole bunch of engineers who are lined up in front of you. And the recession is hitting. The times are tough. I can't really hire you. The only thing I've got available is a job as an office clerk. And Hoover cut him off and said, that's fine. I can operate a typewriter. My handwriting is legible. When do I start? Well, Janin chuckled a little bit and said, I guess I walked into that one. He gave Hoover the job, and he was impressed immediately. Hoover worked hard, he was smart, he got stuff done, but he wanted to work in the mines, and eventually Janin gave him a chance. A junior engineering spot opened up at a mine in Colorado. After doing well there, he was transitioned to a mine in New Mexico, again performed well. He even got involved in a court case where Janin was a consultant for a client, and Hoover read through this brief that was going to go to the court and said, this isn't right. Let me take it, rework it. He did overnight, came back much, much better. The client wanted to know, how do you know so much about this topic? Well, the topic was the Sierra Nevada mountains, where Hoover had spent 3 summers basically mapping the geography of that region at the great detail level. He knew it, and he impressed both the client and Janin. Well, along came another opportunity from a company called Bewick Mooring. Now, this firm owned mines all around the world. They were based in London, and they were looking for some help from Janin, a recommendation for someone with experience, perhaps an American, who could help lead their mining interests in Western Australia. Someone maybe around 35 years old might fit the bill. Well, Janin thought Hoover was right for this. Herbert Hoover was 23 at the time, so he wrote back to Charles Mooring, the head of the firm, said, I've got someone for you. He's, quote, not quite 35. But Hoover went anyway. He grew a beard and mustache, tried to look a little bit older, went off to London, met Charles Mooring. They hit it off, and he gave him the job. Off he was to Western Australia, not making $2 a day anymore. Now he's going to make $7,000 a year. Landed near Perth on the western side of Australia, went to the gold mining town of Coolgardie. Unlike anything he had ever seen before. Red dust, black flies, and white heat, he wrote into a letter to his brother Tad. There were no birds, no animals, no beasts except ants and flies, chiefly flies, graves everywhere, indicating the spot his water bag became empty and warning others to bring larger bags or more bottles. Temperature in Coolgardie, usually over 100 degrees. The rainfall, less than 1 inch a year. But the real problem was the mine itself. They'd been digging in this mine for about 5 years, and as far as Hoover was concerned, the gold was gone. It had already been extracted. He decided to shut down this mine and move his operations to Kalgoorlie, about 25 miles away. Again, awful conditions, the heat, no water, but a much more productive mine, partly because he started importing American technology. Also, some American engineers came, gained a lot of loyalty from his workers because he paid them well, he treated them well. They called him Chief, which was a nickname he would have for the rest of his life. Part of Hoover's responsibility was also for prospecting for new mines, new opportunities. So in 1898, he traveled about 150 miles inland in Australia to the Sons of Gwalia mine, which was run by a Welsh team, but they lacked capital, and Hoover thought there was an opportunity here. He studied the data, he studied the geology in question. He said to the folks back at Bewick Mooring, let's invest in this mine. And so they said, okay. $250,000 to buy a stake, another $250,000 for operations. They put Hoover in charge. You got a raise to $10,000 a year plus some small profits. He had the Midas touch. This was his first big stake that turned out well. The Sons of Gwalium mine churned out gold for the next 6 decades, about $50 million worth of gold. The reputation for Herbert Hoover began to soar in the industry. All that said, he was happy to get out of Australia. He had earned his stripes, but it was time to move on when Bewick Moring had a new opportunity for him. And again, he was happy to go. He told his brother Tad, "I am damn glad to get out of here. You would have to know the country to appreciate it. Nothing could be worse." But he wasn't ready to go to China, which was his next opportunity for Bewick Moring, by himself. He had maintained his regular correspondence with his sweetheart at Stanford, Lou Henry. She has just now graduated with her own degree in geology and mining, and he offered in a letter sort of an offhanded proposal to Lou Henry. He said, "Going to China via San Francisco. Will you go with me?" She knew that was a proposal. She said yes. He did travel to the San Francisco Bay Area, south of the Stanford campus in Monterey, California, where he went to the Henry's house, married Lou, immediately got on a ship for the 3.5-week journey to China. That was their honeymoon. They're an intellectual couple, very interested in the Chinese culture and history. They brought a bunch of books with them. The language, well, the languages were better for Lou than it was to Herbert Hoover. He never really learned the language. Lou became proficient in Chinese. They were ready to go to work for Chang Mao. That was his assignment. Chang Mao was the Minister of Mines in China, senior official. He also had a private sector responsibilities for as the technical chief for the Chinese engineering and mining company that was building a port in China. But the big thing that Chang wanted was gold. That's what Hoover was known for in Australia. That's what he wanted to impress his leadership in China. So they initially settled in the town of Tianjin, which is a popular spot for foreigners, had favorable laws there, but he was rarely there. He and Lou traveled all the time, and Chang wanted them to find gold. He was off to Shantung, Shanxi, Manchuria, the Gobi Desert. There frankly wasn't much gold. Hoover kept telling Chang this, but there were a lot of very valuable low-grade ores. Iron, copper, lead could be very profitable. A high demand in the industrialized countries around the world at this time. Again, high demand. Chang was a bit conflicted because he wanted the gold, but eventually they did make a lot of investments and a lot of profitability extracting some of these low-grade ores. The problem was there was tension in China. This is 1900, the turn of the century, and there was a backlash from the inner part of the country against foreigners. Foreigners like Hoover, who would come in and take the Chinese wealth, and influence the culture and change it in not a positive way. Christian missionaries in particular drew the ire of the Boxers, these rebels within China who were having this backlash against foreigners. And many missionaries were killed on the spot for infiltrating into the Chinese culture. All foreigners were all of a sudden at risk as the Boxer rebellion spread throughout all of China. They had a siege going on in the compounds of the foreign dignitaries in Peking and in Tianjin, which is where Hoover brought all of his people back, but they were in great danger. There were thousands of these Boxers surrounding them in a siege, and some of the army that was supposed to be protecting them actually switched to the other side. They only had a few soldiers and about 300 men, plus about 1,000 Chinese who were seeking refuge. They were on the wrong side of the tracks, including Chang on this particular topic. So again, very perilous. They only had one person for every 100 yards to try to guard. If the Boxers came in on all sides, there was really nothing that they were going to be able to do. But they did their best. They put up defense mechanisms. Hoover was out placing people in the right spot, and they eventually were able to get some relief. There was a river that came by with some military officers that were able to at least take the women and children out, but not Lou Hoover. She was going to stay with her husband. At one point, she had a tire shot out from her bicycle. Their place where they were living was bombed. 60,000 cannon shells coming in, but they were still surviving. The best news of all was when the American military finally showed up, not in huge numbers, but enough. And Herbert Hoover said at the time, "I do not remember a more satisfying musical performance than the bugles of the American Marines entering the settlement playing 'There'll Be a Hot Time in the Old Town Tonight.'" Well, those military reinforcements certainly were helpful, but not to bring this to an immediate end, because the Boxers still had them surrounded. But they were professional soldiers, and they agreed with Hoover that they were actually going to attack the Boxers instead of the other way around. Hoover knew the terrain. He was out front. Now, Hoover, a Quaker, he's a pacifist. He did have a rifle with him. He never shot it. The military folks did that, and they beat off the Boxers, and everything got back to being okay. Now, Hoover decided to stay a bit in China, a little bit longer, but some conflict actually ensued between Chang and the Chinese, the Bewick mooring folks, and their Belgian partners, led by Emile Francqui, who eventually manipulated things so that the Belgians actually took ownership of the mines that Hoover was focusing on, and that was sort of the last straw for Hoover. He headed back to London to see what he was going to do next. By the way, he and Francqui would have a very different relationship, not a good one to start, very different about a dozen years from now. We'll talk about that in a future episode. Well, Bewick Mooring, very proud of Hoover. He'd done great for them. They made him a partner, 20% of the firm, again, based in London, but he was always on the go. He was the man in the field. He would circle the globe 5 times over the course of the next 5 years, far more winners than losers. A very high-risk profession. There were lots of mines that didn't generate much. Hoover, it seemed like he had the magic touch. Most of his mines came back profitable. The biggest challenge he had at the beginning was in their own house within Bewick Mooring. The accountant, R.S. Rowe, was a speculator, an investor, a gambler, and he had lost about $1 million that he couldn't pay. What did he do? He raided the accounts of Bewick Mooring to pay off his debts. He skedaddled off to Canada with the money, and all of a sudden, Hoover, with Charles Mooring out of town and unreachable, had to figure out what to do. What are they going to do with all their investors, with the debts that they owed, the debts that Rowe had taken on, even though it was unrelated to the business? And Hoover announced to everybody, we're going to pay them all. We're going to honor all of these debts, even if they're not business related. And this cost him personally a lot of money. About $125,000 came out of his pocket, virtually all of his savings. They had to basically start over. It took about 3 years to replenish those funds. But overall, it actually helped Hoover because the reputation he gained for his honesty and integrity actually helped increase the business for Bewick Mooring and Hoover personally for years to come. The biggest successes for Hoover in this stage of his career, the Broken Hill Mine. This was in New South Wales. He created a new way to extract zinc from the rocks, an oil flotation method. It became an industry standard. He created it, very profitable there in New South Wales, and also in Burma, the Baldwin Mine. 1.5 million tons of lead and zinc and silver came out of that mine over the next 30 years. Again, very profitable. Look, Hoover is absolutely at the top of his profession. He is leading the industry, and he decided to take a break and actually go off on his own. But he did so not just with Lou Henry. Now they had 2 children with him. Herbert Jr. had been born in 1903. Allan came along in 1907. Both of them were hitting the road with their parents after just 5 weeks of age. Hoover would later say that traveling with babies is easier than with most grown-ups. That was the life of young Herbert Jr. and Allan. Again, though, Hoover decided to take a break. He bought out sold his stake in Bewick Mooring. He came back to the United States. He's wealthy, he's successful, he's respected, and decided to stand up his own consulting shop. And people, frankly, were lining up for his services. We were engineering doctors to sick concerns, as the way Hoover put it. Again, their job was to help those who were in trouble, and again, most of the time led to profits. Our operations were a demonstration of an industrial fundamental: greater technical service, more labor-saving devices, lower costs, and larger production at higher wages. That was the success formula for Herbert Hoover. He wanted to be paid in stock to align his incentives with his clients. The most profitable for Hoover in the Ural Mountains. $2 million a year in profits came out of that mine. It ended with the Russian Revolution, when foreigners were actually kicked out. Look, the world at this stage, about to go to war. Life for Herbert Hoover about to completely change. That's the story for another day. That's Herbert Hoover, the great engineer, from the life of Herbert Hoover. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.